Welcome to HortTube. My name is Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do pretty much every Sunday. You can ask gardening questions down in the comments below, and I pick from those each week. I usually pick about 20 to 22, something like that. And there are about 100 questions every week. So don't be offended if I'm not answering yours. It's just, there's a lot of good questions, and thank you guys very much for participating. I think you might be able to see Holly down here below me. I'm sure she'll go back in the back in this area. She has 2 tumors under her neck. I talked about them before. She went to the vet this week, and it was actually fairly positive. They haven't changed at all. In fact, one of them's gotten slightly smaller, so I don't know what's going on there, but she seems to be handling it okay right this minute. So and you know, she seems pretty normal right now. So I'm optimistic that they came on so quick. It just seemed like it was the beginning of the end, and then you know, it just kind of stopped in its tracks. And the vet said they may have grown so fast that they starved themselves of the ability to grow. And so I don't know. Anyway, right now I'm optimistic, and she's doing okay. Okay, so the Learn to Garden video series that's over on my website, I put up a video on foundation plants, and I just showed lots of photos of lots of different foundations and interesting foundation plantings, and talked about overgrown foundations, that kind of thing. Going to be several more videos like that coming on the Learn to Garden series. Again, it's over on my website if you're interested. Thank you guys who have signed up or have purchased it. Several videos this week, a couple before and after videos. I put up the before and after photo videos, and I asked for, you know, you can send before and after garden photos to this email address right here, horttube@gmail.com. I say that in those videos, and so I include 10 emails in each of those videos, and then I get 14 or 15 new emails. So it's falling behind, if anything, and you guys have sent in amazing photos. And again, you'll see your photos at some point, but I've just been amazed with how much participation there is and all the positivity in the emails. And you know, you guys have just done amazing work in your gardens. Let's see, can't remember what else from this week. I'm doing some. I have some upcoming traveling going on. The house is well underway. The front porch hasn't started yet. I'm going to be in Cincinnati this month and several other places. So anyway, let's see. Let's get to some questions from this past week. So somebody's white wedding hydrangeas defoliated during the summer in the Texas heat. It wouldn't matter if it's white wedding or limelight or little lime or any hydrangea paniculata. You know, that they wanted to know if they're dead. And so the only way to know if they're dead is just to go out there and bend the stems a bit and see if they're brittle. And then you can use your thumbnail and scratch down a little ways down on the branch just gently and see if there's any green up under those stems, and that'll let you know whether they're still alive or not. They probably are, and they'll probably just flush right back out. You know, I don't know, you know, they just said Texas. And so, you know, there are places in Texas that those hydrangea paniculatas would probably be great. And then places, you know, along the Gulf probably where they wouldn't be. So again, I don't know where they were. They came out and bloomed, and they're going to bloom in the spring. In zone like 9, those things are going to be spring flowering rather than summer flowering like they are for me. You know, looking back here at my white weddings now, and they still have a bit of color left on them, and it's almost September. That's the difference between growing them in 7B and then growing them down in zone 9. But the fact that they defoliated was almost certainly, obviously, a combination of heat, sun, and you know, and a lack of water or lack of ability for that plant to put water back up in the top faster than it was being taken out. Probably a little bit more of a shade plant for you. And so, you know, and that's going to be the case with a lot of things. There's going to be a lot of things that I would sit here in zone 7B and say, you know, these things do great in the sun, and down in zone 9 in Texas or 8B in Texas, you know, it's going to be a part shade plant. So that's almost certainly the case with those hydrangea paniculatas. Okay, and there's a lot of questions like this. Look, at the end of the season, I'm going to be putting up some videos this week. I went over to the Ralston and took a bunch of photos. I've taken a bunch of photos here and other places, and those videos are going to go up this week on things that are still looking pretty good at the end of summer. It's trying to rain on me a bit. We're right on the edge of this hurricane. We got 1.5 inches of rain last night from the hurricane that hit Florida and came up toward North Carolina. There's maybe 20 mile an hour breeze as well. But the videos, some of the videos that are going up this week are things that are still looking good going into September, because there are perennials, shrubs, ground covers, trees, you know, that really hold up through the summer, and some of them are just putting on a show, you know, at the end of the season, rather than having a spring bloom or an early summer bloom and then just kind of being wiped out by the end of summer. So there's a ton of questions about things looking bad, and it's hard to judge a garden, you know, on how something looks at the end of August or the beginning of September. So I wouldn't stress about it too much. I mean, if I had, see, this question was about perennials looking bad in the late summer. Is it a fail, or is it kind of normal? Well, my cone flowers and my black-eyed Susans and some of my really early blooming salvias, like Salvia nemorosas, and some of those perennials look tough at this time of year. But here we are at the end of August, and the dahlias look great. And some of the other perennials, the fall blooming asters, the anemones, the sedums, you know, some of those things look fantastic. And so it really is a matter of having that combination of ones that will be spring blooming, summer blooming, and then late summer and fall blooming. And so if you have that mixed together, it won't matter that your cone flowers look kind of nuked by the end of summer. And a lot of that, of course, depends on where you are. I mean, you could be in a cooler area and, you know, they just peaked, you know, 3 weeks ago, as opposed to they peaked, you know, 2 or 3 months ago for somebody in the South. So it also depends on where you are in the country as to whether or not your perennials are going to look toasty by the end of summer. But those of us in the South, yeah, a lot of these perennials are, you know, they bloomed early, and then, you know, the summer really worked on them. Insects worked on them, all kinds of things worked on them, and now they look kind of toasty. I leave the seed heads up on most of my stuff regardless, because the goldfinches come along and take them. But I wouldn't worry about it too much, but I would look around and see what is doing well, so that you can make sure what we're trying to accomplish here is to have a year-round garden. So I can have things in decline out here, but it blends right into the fact that other things are in peak at that time. So just keep that in mind. But it's not a fail. It is normal that some portion of your plants are going to, toward the end of summer, be like, please bring on winter and let me go to rest, you know, for the winter. Somebody asked me, what is my favorite weed? Well, it was a weird, you know, that was a strange question. I don't know. This is a weird one, because first of all, a weed is just defined by any plant that's out of place. And so you could have, you know, literally anything be a weed. It could be a native plant that's coming up out here. It could be some Asian exotic, you know, weed that's, you know, trying to take over your garden. It can be, you know, some annual that you planted 3 years ago that won't stop seeding itself, but it was initially planted as something that you enjoyed as a flower. So it's literally any plant in an ornamental garden that's not in a place where you wanted it or planted it. And that's pretty much, you know, the definition of a weed. I was going to say, one of the most annoying weeds is bittercress. Bittercress is absolutely terrible. We had it in a greenhouse when we were doing propagation. You can have it in your, you know, in your garden in all kinds of different spaces, in your lawn. One of the things I really like about it, though, is it has these little projectile seeds. And so it's one of the best, it's one of the coolest weeds for getting itself up, flowering quickly, and then it has a little exploding seed capsule. So anytime you walk past it, it can throw its seeds 10, 15 feet out away from this little teeny tiny plant. And so I just think it's kind of a cool, adaptive plant that's, you know, as much as it's annoying, you also have to kind of acknowledge that this that it just has an amazing adaptability in almost any space in the garden, but it is super annoying. It stays pretty small, little tiny white flowers, but the coolest little seed pods that are kind of fun to kind of thump and see how far those seeds can throw out. And now it's going to actually rain on me, it appears. Okay. All right, so somebody said, what are the advantages to having pollinators if you don't have fruit plants other than just watching them? Okay, it's a good question, really. So I enjoy, having the butterflies and the bees and the interesting wasp and flies and all kinds of cool things that come and pollinate these flowers. Again, like he said, for just watching them. But if you're not trying to get a vegetable garden pollinated or other things, what other advantage would there be? Your garden is a refuge for these things. Keep in mind that the way in which we've developed a good portion of this country is row crop farming, which has basically almost nothing for our native species. And then the way we've done ornamental gardening for the last 100 years is to plant 7 boxwoods on a foundation and then try to maintain some lawn like we're playing golf. And so, these spaces that you're creating are a refuge for these creatures. And as long as we're not spraying pesticides in them, then this is a place where they can be. And if we can connect a lot of houses together and a lot of neighborhoods together and a lot of spaces together, these species of native bees and native things will be here forever. So just keep that in mind. Just, you're part of a system. You're basically putting back a system that was here before. And, we're doing that with natives. We're doing that with non-natives. There's tons of non-native plants that these native pollinators absolutely love. And some of them, extend the period of time that things are available to them and that kind of thing. So, but that combination, so that's what it is. I mean, I look at this garden as this is a safe space. 3 years, the first year, just a few bumblebees out here. Second year, more. This year, we have so many native bees out here. We've given a spot for them to come. They now know to come here, and they're probably nesting in the ground near here, all these solitary bees. So that's just kind of fun. I know that I'm building their numbers. I can visually see it year over year over year. And there'll be years where it'll dip and dive. Obviously the weather and events will have some impact on that. But keep in mind, your garden is a refuge for some things that we have done a very poor job of seeing as we've developed, a country with an interstate system and row crop farming and again, 7 shrubs and a cloud of dust and big giant fields of lawns, have not given opportunity to these creatures to share the space with us. So that's what, keep that in mind. That's part of it. Okay, so somebody bought 3 Ilex crenata that are about 18 inches tall, and they want to know how to make them 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide fast. Okay, so a couple things. Ilex crenata, it's Japanese holly. It's the small leaf hollies, but they come in all different shapes and sizes. So like sky pencil hollies are tall and narrow, soft touch hollies are little mounds, hellerii hollies are slightly taller mounds. Compacta hollies are the most common, probably one that looks like it's boxwood-like, and that's the one that would probably grow 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide on its own. It'll get taller than that, but you could maintain 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide. So I don't know what Ilex crenata you bought. This was in England, I think. It was in Europe. I think it was in England. So I don't know what Ilex crenata you bought. Assuming it's compacta, the way to get any holly to grow fast is to prune it occasionally. So what we'll do is, if you get 6 inches of growth on it or 4 inches of growth on it pretty quick in the spring, you can give it just a bit of a haircut. You can take about 1 inch off the end of those branches, and that will stimulate new growth. So that's how we grew them in the nursery. We would allow them to flush out. Take a sky pencil holly, for example. Sky pencil holly, it grows 6 inches real quick in the container in the spring. We take 2 inches of that growth off, just off with its head. It grows another 4 or 6 inches almost immediately. So that's how we made those things grow faster. A little bit of pruning occasionally through the growing season will make them grow faster. But again, I don't know what Ilex crenata you actually purchased. So somebody just mentioned that they had done the wood chip. They had a wood chip pile and had spread it out over some space, and it's created the most amazing soil. They couldn't dig in their soil before, and now they can, and they just wanted to make sure that that they had mentioned this, that, you know, this thing I talk about getting the soil covered in lots of organic material initially, you know, waking your soil up, has worked well for them. Okay, so somebody has raised beds, and when they water, the water just pours through it really quickly. I think they said they had sand and compost or something mixed together. I don't remember now, but it's basically, so it's either one of two things. It either drains it way too well, like it's a chunky material that the water just falls through faster than it can actually absorb into the material, or it's hydrophobic. If you had like a peat moss soil, and when peat moss gets dry, sometimes it's really hard to re-wet it, and there are other soils that can do that too. You'll see water just sheet off of it rather than being absorbed into it. So you could have either one of those two conditions. I think you just need to get some more compost mixed into it to slow the fall of the water through it. You could use peat moss as well, but compost would be perfectly fine, and that could just be cow manure if you wanted to. A good quality cow manure, and just mix that into the first few inches of it, and that should help create some aeration, and also you know, just slow that water down enough that it's getting soaking in before it falls all the way through. Let's see. So somebody has a 20-year-old holly. They want to cut it to the ground, and when would you do that? So they had read that the best time to prune these hollies is after they bloom in the spring, but that would be kind of silly if you were going to cut the thing to the ground, because who cares if it flowers, you weren't going to have the berries on it anyway, other than the bees would be able to take advantage of those flowers, and the bees do absolutely love those Chinese hollies, oh my gosh, and our native broadleaf hollies. But I would just do it in the dead of winter or toward the end of winter. You can cut that old holly down and it will come back quick. Keep in mind, when you take a 20-foot tall tree, or, you know, a 20-foot tall leafy shrub like that, and you cut it down to, let's say you cut it down to 2 feet tall, it's going to come back with 4 or 5 suckers that are going to try to grow really, really fast and be super, super thin. You're going to need to pick a new leader. And then you're going to want to prune that. You're going to want to put a little bit of work in next year into trying to reshape something as it's coming back out. Otherwise, it's going to come back up as 8 or 10 suckers that are just going to grow straight up, and they're going to grow 5 or 6 feet in a single season, and the thing's not going to look all that great. So I think you need to pick a vigorous leader as the new leader, and then cut it off at some height, and then, you know, have it branch and turn it back into a little Christmas tree thing. But it'll reset. I mean, almost all hollies of any age, you can cut them to the ground. It's just going to take a little bit of work. So somebody has a begonia, and this could be kind of any, a lot of these things that are out here in the garden that will be annuals because the winter is going to kill them, are actually perennials. Things like coleus and some of our most begonias. Lots of these things are actually perennial. But we use them as annuals, and then the fall kills them or the winter kills them, and then they don't come back. So this was a particular for begonia. Can they root cuttings on them? Yeah, you can root cuttings on any of these things. If you look around your garden right now and you know something is going to be dying out there and you want to try to save it, you can absolutely root cuttings. Most of these vigorous growing perennials like that, you can root easily. I mean, you can root tomatoes. They're perennials. You can root peppers. You know, they're tomatoes. You can hold them through the winter in a greenhouse if you wanted to, and put the same pepper plant, a clone of the same pepper plant, back in the ground. They're actually perennials. We treat them as annuals. We grow them, either the disease or something gets them, or frost kills them to the ground. But any of those things that are actually perennial somewhere, you can try to take cuttings on. Most of them root easily. Tomatoes root easily. Peppers root easily. Begonias, coleus, any of those things. You can root them in, some coleus you can root in water. and then you need a super bright window or some sort of greenhouse space, and make sure they're getting plenty of light. Otherwise, they tend to get spider mites, most of those things in the house during the winter time if they're not getting enough light. But yes, any of those things you want to try to save, now is the time to go out and root them, and most of them root easy. I have lots of propagation videos on the channel. So somebody has high pH soil in their containers. They're in Texas, which I don't think mattered. They're using acid soil mixes and fertilizer, but somehow their pH is between 7 and 8. I have no idea how that's happening, because if you're using an acid potting mix, usually that's going to be peat moss, and peat moss has typically a pretty low pH. Pine bark wood as well. Compost is probably going to be neutral, somewhere 6.5 or 7 in all likelihood. So I have no idea why your pH is running high in these containers. You definitely want to use something with some sulfur in it, like Hollytone is what I'd be fertilizing these containers with if they had a high pH. And also question your pH tester. So if you're seeing consistent high readings in container mixes that were supposed to be for acid-loving plants, there could be something wrong with your pH meter. I don't know if you bought one on Amazon or something, or if you sent it off to a lab. I'm going to talk more about soil samples in just a minute, but you might want to question that reading as well. Let's see. I talk about this when you dig a hole in the clay. You're really kind of digging a clay pot in the ground, and water is always going to find the easiest way into the ground. And so when we're planting plants in our garden in clay soils, the water is going to find the area that's newly dug and fall into that space, which could potentially displace the air pockets that are in the soil around your plants, and then rot them and cause root rot. So this person they had gone to their garden center, and their garden center recommended that they poke holes around their plants, that they plant everything up in really shallow holes, and then poke holes around them to create oxygen. I think that's probably just overthinking things. I would dig the hole as if you're going to plant the thing deep, and just and then plant them up a bit high. If you can find pine bark soil conditioner to mix in, that's good. If your clay is particularly hard and particularly compact, again, I've said this, I want to make sure I say this, most everyone watching does not need to amend the soil in the actual hole with anything, okay? I do and have shown that some compost gets mixed in when I dig holes, mainly because there's compost on the top of the soil out here from all this stuff breaking down. And at the old house where I had particularly compact spaces, I would mix in some pine bark soil conditioner to keep that clay from readily recompacting. But you don't have to. I want to always say that when I'm talking about amending soils, that most folks don't have to. If you have extremely compact clay, I do like to mix in some pine bark soil conditioner, which is what these plants are actually grown in. This container with this arborvitae right here, I can see it right here on the top. It's pine bark soil conditioner is what that thing's being grown in, with a little bit of that, and then with a little bit of your existing soil, a little bit of pine bark, and then leave the plants up some. They'll be aerated enough, and that'll get them up off the bottom of that hole enough that it shouldn't be an issue. I think anything beyond that is just overthinking it. Also, keep in mind, if you take a steel prod and you poke it into the ground, did you create aeration or compaction? Okay, a core aerator, like you aerate your lawn, actually, Holly's trying to go in, I gotta do that, actually takes a core and pulls it out of the soil, okay? If you take a probe and actually stick a probe down in the ground, you've actually compacted the soil left and right of where that probe went into the ground. So I don't think it would be effective as you think it is anyway. Somebody asked advice on spider mites, and I just want to go back and reiterate, this is the time of year when you'll see lots of spider mites, because a lot of your plants are under stress from heat, from drought, from all kinds of scenarios that take place over the course of a summer. That spider mites are generally stress-related things. If you're seeing spider mites on conifers in the south, that's because some of those conifers don't like to be in the south. If you're seeing spider mites on your house plants, a lot of times they're not getting enough light or water or whatever they need. most spider mite issues are, you know, and I'll see it on inferior cultivars. I've talked about that. Lots of different scenarios in which you get spider mites on things. There are butterfly bushes can get them sometimes. Some of the varieties that have been introduced are just not great, and I see spider mite issues on some of those, and literally they're just inferior cultivars. But keep in mind, if you're having spider mite infestations, something is stressed about that plant. It's underwatered, unlikely overwatered, in all likelihood underwatered, or this, you know, it's in too hot of a space in some way or another, or it's just not something that's going to. When things start to get spider mites for me, that's when they kind of exit the garden pretty quick. Let's see. So somebody has a 9-bark in Winston-Salem, Physocarpus, and it got cooked during the summertime. You know, they want to know if they can just reset it. They can cut it down to the ground. Yeah, you can cut 9-barks down to the ground in the early spring, late winter, early spring. They respond very well to coming back up. It has not been in the ground long enough to judge whether or not it's just too hot in the space that it's in. It had only been in the ground for this year or a year or something like that. So I don't know that we can judge a whole lot from it. We are on the southern end of the range of where they like to be. And I don't see that many 9-barks in the Raleigh area. Winston-Salem's a little cooler, just to the west, and then kind of starting to get up to the foothills of Appalachia there. And it's, so generally speaking, a few degrees cooler every day, but still, we don't have a whole lot of them here. But you can try late winter. You can cut it down, and then judge next year's performance as to whether or not it needs to go in more shade, or you may not have a space for it in your garden. Somebody bought some 2-quart hydrangeas in zone 7B, wanted to know if they could plant them this fall. Yeah, as long as they've got some size on them. 2 quarts isn't a tiny. I plant a lot of quart things out here in the garden, so 2 quarts sounds like a big plant to me. Yeah, you can definitely in zone 7B, you can definitely put those hydrangeas in the ground in the fall, and they should be fine. They'll be better in the ground than they would be in the container. The container would make them more vulnerable to the cold. Okay. You know, sometimes when something's that small, though, you know, you can end up having some foot traffic on it or something like that during the winter time. Could be an issue. So, you know, you may want to think about protecting them in some way, you know, to keep somebody from stepping on it while it's dormant. Okay, so somebody just threw out that they had become a trimming expert from watching the channel. And they get a lot more flowers by deadheading things. Yeah, don't be scared to cut on anything. Really, that's a lot of gaining knowledge in gardening, is experimenting with cutting on things. Most of these leafy plants respond well to being pruned and being cut on, and don't mind at all. Some of those videos, some people go, "Oh my God, I can't believe you just cut that thing." I put up that maple video this week, you know, and I just butcher the thing in the video, but it won't have any problem. It will respond fantastic to that. So don't be scared of that kind of thing. Let's see. So somebody has their oak leaf hydrangea up in zone 6B. The flowers went from white to basically black. It was another one that was pretty newly planted. That's what they do here in my area. They bloom in May, and then by midsummer, the flowers are just black. We don't normally get any of the kind of pinks that you can get in them, or the slow process of them going from green to white to kind of a pinkish color to brown and big, good cut flowers. Here it's just hot. It goes hot pretty quick, and they tend to bloom out all at once and then kind of be over it. So I'm assuming just the first year it being in the ground, that stress has probably created a much shorter bloom time for you. And then somebody wanted to know about pruning oak leaf hydrangeas. They're in zone 6 in Cincinnati, and again, I'm gonna be in Cincinnati toward the end of the month. You know, down here, what I just said is they bloom so early that we can prune on them here after they've kind of peak bloomed, and we can prune on them pretty hard, and they'll flush back out enough to reset flower buds. As you get into colder and colder areas, they bloom later and later in the summer, and there's not as much time for them to reset flower buds by by pruning. So the only pruning I would do on an oak leaf hydrangea up in zone 5 or 6 is probably just going to be right under the flowers typically, if I want them to reliably bloom the next year. So basically just prune, you know, and then buying varieties that fit the space a little bit better, because we have lots of new dwarf and smaller growing cultivars. So if you buy Snow Queen, which we know gets 12, 15 feet tall, and you're trying to keep it 4 feet tall, that's going to be problematic in colder zones, because when they bloom is so late in the summer that if you do any serious hacking on them at that point, you are going to cost yourself flowers the next year. As opposed to, again, they'll grow all the way down to the Gulf Coast and stay virtually evergreen, or keep those red leaves through the winter, which is quite attractive. And again, they're going to bloom early there. They can prune them and they'll have time. So this is as much about where you live as anything else. But buying the appropriate size one, I think, is really important in the colder areas. So somebody asked about mulching for weed suppression, and will perennials still push through that? So they wanted to know how much mulch. So I mulch twice a year. I mulch in like March 1st. I was late this year doing it, but typically I want to mulch around March 1st, because around the mid-March is when the soil temperature heats up enough that crabgrass and a lot of our other weeds germinate. When the soil temperature hits about 65, somewhere in there, that's when the summer weeds start to germinate. And you may not see them for a long time. They may just be germinated and be you just be putting little roots down in the ground, and then later in the summer, you know, they just go and go crazy, as we know crabgrass does. I put down probably about 2 inches of mulch in the spring, and then about 2 inches of mulch about now in the fall, typically, to prevent some of those fall weeds. Perennials don't have any problem pushing through them at all. If you've got established perennials, there's no hosta that 2 inches of mulch is going to stop from coming up, or daylilies, or agapanthus, or anything. All that stuff will push through. If you're worried about a particular plant that you've just put in the ground or something, you can leave a little well around it if you're concerned about it. But most all of these perennial things will push right through 2 inches of mulch with no problem. But a lot of people say mulch with 3 to 4 inches of mulch. I'm doing that. I'm just cutting it in half and doing it twice a year. Okay. So somebody wanted to know if they could reset their serviceberry tree. It's in dappled light and it's stretched a lot, and it only has leaves out on the end. Yes, you can cut that thing down, and then you'll get a lot of suckers, and you'll have to cut it down to 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever you want to keep. Keep in mind, if it was stretching before, it's going to stretch again, and it's just going to, and now you got a giant root system, like that holly question we had earlier, that 20-foot holly. It's going to grow like mad, because it's got the root system of a 20-foot tall plant. It's going to grow wild. Same thing with that serviceberry. It's going to stretch and grow like a weed. So if it's out of place in too much shade and thin already, it's going to respond the exact same way and stretch again on you. Just throwing that out there. Jim always has good news. Let's see. So somebody's camellias got burned in the December freeze, and what happened was they flushed back out, but they only flushed back out in the new growth. No foliage came back in the middle of the plant. So they should have flower buds on them now if they're going to flower this fall. So they'll flower a few flowers probably this fall. Late winter, early spring, you can just give them a tip pruning all the way around, and that should encourage some new growth in the center of the plants. But that's the way you would do it. It's just a small amount of pruning late winter, early spring next year, and that should help fill them in from the bottom. Camellias aren't the best at coming back from the center of the plant. There are lots of other leafy evergreens that are much, much better at it. They tend to, over time, kind of tree form themselves regardless. Doesn't seem like there's a lot of dormant buds down in the old growth on camellias. But these plants are young enough, they probably will produce plenty of new growth down in the middle for you to fill them back in enough. Okay, let's see. Last question for this week, and again, thank you guys for participating in the question and answer videos. Where do you suggest sending soil samples? So you can order soil sample test kits on Amazon and then send them into a lab, and then they'll electronically send them results by email, or you can take them to my, Wake County has the drop-off place isn't far from me where you can take soil samples. You can generally get the boxes for that from your extension agent. So if I went to, the Wake County extension agent will have, these little brown boxes, or I can at the drop-off place for the thing, I can bring it in a little baggie, and then you transfer it to this little box and then write the stuff on the outside of the box, your address and your email address and all that kind of stuff. And most of it's all sent electronically now. I am actually going to do a video in the next few weeks. I had a meeting down in Alabama a couple weeks ago with a company that does, it's a sod company, and they also have a business doing soil testing. And I had a lunch meeting with these folks, and they were testing my knowledge, and I was kind of testing their knowledge, because I wanted to make sure that they're not going to be recommending just a ton of stuff to kind of micromanage your ornamental landscapes. Because when we get soil tests done, a lot of times, soil testing and the thoughts on soil are so much based on row crops. And for a row crop farmer, having the exact amount of phosphorus and the exact amount of potassium and the exact amount of nitrogen and the exact amount of calcium or whatever, and ratios, can be the difference between getting this many bushels per acre versus this many bushels per acre. So they really will get in and kind of fine tune what's going on in their soils, because it's a significant amount of money. It's the same effort in, you can get this much money or this much money, and you spent the same amount regardless. And so those guys will micromanage it. I don't want you guys getting soil tests done and then somebody telling you you need this, you need to be adding this tiny amount of phosphorus and tiny amount, most of the time for these ornamental plants, the soil doesn't have to be perfect. As long as you have some of everything and your pH is in the right window for the things that you're trying to plant in your garden, and you're keeping the soil covered in organic material, most of you are fine without doing any additional amending. Not all of you though. Somebody out there needs something. So I'm going to be doing a video on this soil test kit from this company down in Alabama. Basically, they'll send you this thing, it's self-addressed, you send it to them, and then you get them back. And I'll do one from here as well, and we can just go over it in a video. But I kind of found someone who is like-minded, that doesn't want to try to micromanage your ornamental landscapes and treat you like a row crop farmer. So thank you guys for following along, and again, ask questions down in the comment section. Thanks again.